I'm John Firth. I'm an executive coach and consultant here in downtown Brooklyn, but I cover most of New York City and have clients obviously outside of the city. I am also a Vistage chair. For those of you who don't know Vistage, we put together groups of CEOs, mostly of small, medium-sized businesses and owners of such businesses, so that they can actually work together to be better and to find a better balance between work and life, but most importantly, to hold each other accountable for our actions, for our behaviors, and for our leadership. And this is a topic that comes up all the time. So I'm going to ask Larry to introduce himself, and we'll start with the conversation.
I'm Larry Reines. I'm with the Alternative Board tab. And much like John, I work with small business owners, and we do hold them accountable, and we meet once a month to work on their opportunity and their challenges. And we do create a board, and the board holds the business owners accountable to themselves, to what they're doing and moving their business forward. We've been around 30 years. I'm here in Bergen County, New Jersey, across the river. John and I are friendly, and we coordinate, and we discuss a lot as we work sort of hand in hand in the same industry, and it's a great alliance that we found. So thank you for having me today, John. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And likewise, we always have fascinating conversations. Now we're going to let all of you in on them. Let's talk a little bit about the society at large and this whole topic that has really taken fire really in the last 5 years of how do we hold our leaders accountable? Are our leaders accountable? And to what extent does a CEO's accountability really matter? And that is a big question. So my question now to Larry is, why is that? Why is this happening? And what it is about society or the society dialogue that has just turned this into really a national debate?
So it's a great question, and it's why we're here. So much is going on in society today. The social aspect of it, the business aspect of it, technology, and of course the pandemic. And the confluence of things that are happening all at once. The social movement is pushing their agenda onto corporations and onto CEOs, and CEOs are responding, and we see that quite often in the news. There's technology that's come on board, and we're watching how, for example, Zoom is being used, and how there's become a disconnect with a hybrid workforce and an in-person workforce, and how that's affecting the culture of the companies. And people are looking to the top now. They're making the money, and they're asking questions, and they want answers.
Right. And this is a topic also for our clients. It's not just society at large, but let's talk a little bit about how our clients are, I don't want to say struggling, but how it starts with awareness that maybe their accountability could be better and starts snowballing into something quite big. I think of one of my clients, one of the few hired CEOs that were that was in my Vistage group. He runs a company for Mark Cuban's business partner. And he came to me with a simple mandate that his business, the owner, the investor of the business, was very hands-off. And Ben, wanting to really perform, began to get nervous that he literally wasn't being held accountable in the true sense of the word. The meetings with his investor were really just updates. It wasn't the investor holding him accountable or picking on things that he thought should be done. And my Vistage member really had this feeling like it may not be working the way he wants it to work. And it was true. There were certain things the investor was looking for that my client was delivering on, but they weren't as exciting as the investor wanted to see in terms of returns. So Ben and I started building accountability exercises and holding him accountable, because he said that was what he needed. He needed someone somewhere holding himself accountable. And once that started happening, he has had an amazing year and a half. It's just blown he's tripled their EBITDA. And that's because of the simple fact that he said, I need a solution. This sounds like a good solution. Let me use it. Now, I know you've had also similar types of situations that haven't gone so well.
No, they definitely have gone south. There is one instance where a business owner slash CEO, he was a CEO, he had investors he had to speak to, and he ran amok. He ran wild, going in a direction that appeared on the surface on the veneer to be good, but he wasn't held accountable for what he spent. He took the overhead and he created the overhead of well above what he should have done, and the investors never held him accountable. And what happened in the end is that his spending went so wild that the vendors started to hold him accountable. And that's sort of like the natural progression of accountability, right? When nature comes in and makes it happen. So why I'm equating vendors to nature, because it's natural for someone to want to get paid for their work.
Right.
And if someone spends too much and payments slow down, then all of a sudden the supply chain becomes affected.
Right.
In fact, he was affected by that, and they actually went so drastic as to get together as a group and put him into a Chapter 7, and that was his accountability. It was what I call the natural accountability.
Right.
He didn't handle things right. His employees couldn't stop him. His investors couldn't stop him. So someone did eventually stop him. And there is accountability always. It might be that ugly where your business is in Chapter 7. Or it could be in the case of what we try to do for a living, and that is, hey, let's not get there. Let's be accountable with our services, with our mentorship, with our coaching, so that you can move your business in the direction, and that you do answer to someone if the unnatural force of an investor group or an advisory board is not there to help.
Yeah, and we see other examples throughout history where the accountability question gets muddled. First thing I thought of just now was Chernobyl. If you've seen that series, where it's very clear that nobody was holding themselves accountable. Everything from how the first nuclear reactor, or how that nuclear reactor was designed. I'm not a physicist, but essentially it was a cheap solution that when they have a meltdown, they had literally a meltdown, and all the safety measures they had been taught no longer were valid. But anybody running the plant didn't know that. Only the bureaucrats who made that decision. That's an example of accountability just completely falling apart. So when I hear you talk, I obviously say, capitalism is a system that if you're not being accountable, it's going to come out. It's going to come out, and it's going to come out in very ugly ways, but also very transparent ways. Usually numbers will tell you.
We see it today in how many people are leaving their job because the culture is not the culture that they're interested in. And if the leadership, the CEO, doesn't create the DNA for a proper leadership and a proper culture, then he's going to have an exodus of talent. And it's going to be hard to attract talent if you become known for not being concerned about your culture and creating a good culture. That
leads me to the question of, and we'll end this section in a second. What do we think society expects in terms of accountability? You bring up one aspect of accountability, which is accountability for the right culture, for accountability for living that culture and not just saying the words. What other accountabilities do you see?
Well, so there's accountability to your team. Mm-hmm. There's accountability to the society at large and for the greater good of business. And then there's accountability to yourself and your family, right? So we can't forget about that. Right. There's an exodus of people leaving the C-level jobs. And it's basically after COVID, after recession, after everything that's gone over the past 2 years, or the COVID recession, I should say, pending that's coming today with supply chain issues. You're at the helm of a company now, and you don't know what's going to happen next, and there's stress there, and people are very concerned about their work-life balance. Mm-hmm. So the C-level person is as well saying, "What am I doing here?" Right?
Yeah.
So Jeff Bezos did it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example of someone who held himself accountable. For me, Jeff Bezos represents a number of accountabilities. Somebody has to be held accountable for results. But that's the easy one. Let's call it the numbers. But I think CEOs also have to be accountable for everything that goes into that. So they have to be accountable for making good decisions. They have to be accountable for communicating, not just the decisions, but other things. They have to be authentic. They have to be accountable for being the person they are and working on themselves so they become better as leaders. They have to be responsible for the behavior and then their behaviors. And then there's the part that we deal with, and which we'll talk about in a second, which is the accountability, what's going on in your brain, your mindset that results in a state of being of accountability. And that's what you and I spend a lot of time dealing with, is that mindset, either to be held, that results in being accountable, or for some reason is a unproductive mindset that for some reason you don't hold yourself accountable. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay. So if you've just joined us, I'm John Firth, sitting here with Larry Reines, and we'd love to hear any comments and questions that you have during the session, but also after the session's over. And very quickly, I'm going to have Larry's information here up here on screen. Feel free to write it down, take a picture of it, and you can get in touch with Larry. And I would recommend that any questions you have after the session that you think Larry can answer better for whatever reason, either you know of him or you know him, or there's something he said that you're interested in, please talk to him. After the second break, I'll give you my information.
Cool.
So again, don't hesitate to tell us about anything that you think is germane to the conversation, and most importantly, ask questions, and we will show them. So I'm John Firth of Firth & Associates, and a chair with Vistage. Larry?
I'm Larry Reines with the Alternative Board, also founder of Aaron Meyer Consulting Group here in Bergen County. And thank you for joining us today.
So let's move on to our next section. The next section is the actual mindset, what goes on inside somebody, and when does it become imperative that they get it, that they get the accountability issue, and how does that exhibit itself? So I'll kick it off and say that accountability is not just a mindset, but it's also a combination of discipline and good habits. All of us can be, well, I don't know how all of us, but I know I can be highly, highly neurotic about moments when I'm not being accountable. So I represent, and I think Larry does too, solopreneurs, if you will. We don't have big organizations behind us. We're kind of out on our own. So does anybody hold us accountable? No. So how do we stay accountable? So let's talk about the different kinds of leaders and how they find their way to being held accountable. So Larry, I know you want to talk a little bit about hired CEOs with boards and so forth.
Yeah, I could go there. They're in preparing and just thinking about this and talking with John this week, I did a little looking, and I saw there are issues like John Foley, the CEO of Peloton, and there's an active investor that's holding him accountable, an activist investor that's holding him accountable for his very vague, repeated failures and ineffectively leading, which is sort of a nebulous thing, which is that's very public, that's very out there. Vashil Garg from Better.com has a mortgage company. He fired 900 people by Zoom the other day, took a little break, and he became self-accountable. No one actually fired the guy, which is the repercussions of firing people by Zoom is staggeringly zero. But he did take time. He took time off, and now he is trying to repair what he's done through working with an executive coach and working on the values that he opened the business. So, there are these different people in the public eye that are out there who are not solopreneurs, who are being held accountable. In this one case by an activist board, in another case just by a conscience. And I think what we deal with our solopreneurs and with our smaller businesses is the conscience and the DNA of the owners and the people that they are and what they want to be and who they attract. I have one member who his biggest concern was who he hired and did they properly represent his company. And that in and of itself created a culture that was astounding, because all of a sudden you have a group of people of a specific nature. He's accountable to himself. He made sure that however he did it, that bringing on the right person was the number one thing in his mind, because that's the culture that he wanted.
Right.
So he did it. It really didn't even, as a matter of fact, it might have been to his detriment. It was like, okay, let's pull back a little bit because now you need workers. Maybe you're looking for too much perfection.
Mm-hmm.
But there is some self-accountability. And when there's not, people do come to boards like we have to get that, where someone tells them from the outside who's not a stakeholder in the business. Ironically, not being a stakeholder becomes a benefit, because we're saying, okay, our job is to make sure you're doing the right thing.
Right.
So let's talk about what you're doing wrong. Let's take a flashlight and look in the corners and see what's there and make sure we weed that out. And you know what? Let's put it in front of your face and make you address it.
Right, exactly. That's the moment of truth. As experienced coaches, we know the signs of a CEO or a business owner, actually, really, I think where we're going, who does not have, I'm going to say, doesn't really have the DNA of being held accountable. Now, it's, the reason why we're in business is God thought better about giving us objectivity. We don't have objectivity. And I don't know if you have this experience, but I find many solutions to these big whopping problems that they end up having sometimes is right here. It's right smack in front of their face. And it's always amazing to me that that's the solution that ends up being there. Well, that's with it accountable. You almost assume that any CEO or person in some sort of power in a leadership role is going to be accountable. But there are people who can't even begin to think what that's about and aren't even aware that that's being accountable. And you see that especially among some of the experiences examples you use. I had an example when I was working for the CEO of Sony. I was helping him with some reorganization, and it became increasingly aware to me from my colleagues sort of surrounding me in corporate in Tokyo that the CEO, Mr. Ide, this is before Howard Stringer, who took over as their first non-Japanese CEO, was literally not listening to anybody. He, especially when it came to communication, he would be, he'd had a team of communications people who would prepare him for, TV interviews, for speeches, for videos, all the stuff that a CEO does in a big company. And he'd go off script immediately. He'd go off script. And it was almost like he purposely avoided anyone telling him what to do. Well, he didn't last very long. I was there when he was forced to resign, and Howard took over, who is, with all of his faults, a very accountable person. He takes responsibility and accountability seriously. His issues were slightly different, but I was there when a CEO of a major corporation was asked to resign because he just wasn't holding himself accountable. So I guess, I'd like to ask what your experience has been when despite everything, a CEO, and especially an entrepreneur or a small business owner who doesn't have anybody above them, what does that mean in terms of getting them to understand accountability and become accountable themselves?
Great question, and it's not that simple of an answer, because there's a very large group of guys out there, guys and girls out there that don't want to be held accountable.
Yeah, right. And in fact, have a mindset of accountability means our company has become boring. We're not innovative. There's all this belief sometimes that gets churned up about accountability.
And I don't want the pressure of it. And it's not that bad. And so what? I could make more money. And it doesn't matter. I'm happy the way I am today. And I can give you a laundry list, right? So there's there's an understanding you need it, but not always wanting it, right? I'm doing it.
No, you could say they're self-sabotaging, they're on a suicide mission career-wise if they don't get that.
Right.
I often find that a sign that there's a problem, obviously, is when the board has one set of beliefs of what accountability is and the CEO has others. It usually falls on the lines of the board wants to see more innovation. And in the case of the CEO of Sony, he had done a great job cleaning up the balance sheet. Really, financially, the company was strong, but he wasn't particularly innovative. He wasn't an engineer, a hardware engineer, or even a software engineer at Sony when a time came that they would not listen to any leader who wasn't. So it became hard for him to be accountable. But it's he suddenly had this mindset that he had to single-handedly, and one reason why he hired me is to get some reinforcement, is bring a new wave, a new culture, if you will, into a very large multinational company. His board wasn't looking that way. The board wanted to see innovation, and the innovation they were seeing wasn't particularly good. And then results started worsening, which is, of course, the best scorecard that anybody has to let them know that they're not being accountable.
Right.
But that was an example where what he thought was accountable, or when he was being accountable, what he thought was the right thing, was not in agreement with what the board and a lot of his leadership team and the rest of the employees at Sony.
It's funny. We spoke about it in the previous segment, but when you bring up the numbers, there's an interesting paradigm happening with the social movement and the numbers, because a lot of the younger generation, if you will, is as much interested in the social justice aspect of a corporation as it is the profits. And so CEOs, and that might be why there's a lot of CEOs that are starting to step down.
Mm-hmm.
Because wait a minute. So wait, what? What do you want? Wait, are we here for money or are we here for social justice? Wait, we're here for both. Well, where's the balance? So now, you're in an area of responsibility without authority. If I'm going to call it that, in a way, because you don't know where's the scale,
right?
When is it? Oh, wait, you didn't make enough money, but I was doing this, and it costs money, and then you weren't doing this well. Well, I have to look for my. So there's a challenging time, and then if you throw a pandemic on top of that,
right?
Wait, what do you want these guys to do? And then they just say, my kid's home from school, and people are not. People can pivot all they want. It's the fact that the word in the past 2 years, we have to pivot, but there comes a time when you have to say, it's too hard to pivot this way. And I don't know where my accountability is or what it is. Is it defined clear enough? Mm-hmm. And if you're starting to add all these things together, like, what does success look like? And if you can't define what success looks like in the end and measure it through KPIs or some formula, accountability becomes a mushy word. It sounds good, and it
means nothing. Yeah. It's you bring up a good point, which is, what is a CEO actually being held responsible for? And 9 times out of 10, it's quote unquote results. But even within that, we always say that business has very clear indications of performance or non-performance. It'll be in the numbers. You'll see it in the numbers. But that's actually a simplistic view of what it means to be accountable, because there's lots of ways of making numbers. You can easily steal and make money. I mean, you can be unethical and make money. And that's an example of what can happen in some worst case examples where it goes overboard. You can be, your belief about being accountable for the culture and the culture you want to have can turn out to be not being accountable to some higher good of human standard. Travis Kalanick of Uber is a perfect example. He did nothing to adapt the culture from being a smart, aggressive, highly aggressive culture that was going out to change the world. That didn't change. And he was at 12,000 employees. When you're at that level, that size, and you haven't baked in certain processes and made some decisions that are contrary to what your culture was like at the beginning of a company, he fell on his sword really, really well. But his results also sucked. So it was an easy equation. You don't understand that you are accountable for the culture of a company that will make them successful. The culture that you have chosen to go with is not making you successful, not making you very successful. In fact, it's putting the company in danger. So you are no longer a CEO,
Right.
at least not at this company.
No, and it's getting more and more difficult because it's becoming gray area.
Mhm.
And it sounds like sometimes you're weaponizing the accountability, and that's a bad thing. You're going to not get your best talent to want to come forward and make other people money. Maybe they'll do it as an entrepreneur without going public, and that way they can only answer to themselves in their own manner.
Oh yeah, and I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs, successful and highly unsuccessful, who have decided the buck stops with them. Well, there are a lot of bucks on people's desks when the buck stopped and it still stayed there, weren't taken care of. But that leads us to our next section in a second, which is how do entrepreneurs, without anybody really above them, really left to their own devices, maybe the devices of their spouse too, who may have a hand in that, how do they then deal with, let me call it the discipline and good habits of accountability? But again, I want to remind people that we would love to see your comments and questions during the session. So please, there's a comment box for you to write something in. As soon as we see one coming up, we will put it up in that banner that you see at the bottom of this page. And certainly I want to remind you that we are available, and I'll show you now how you can get in touch with me to answer any questions and to hear your comments about this, and then any other topics that you might be interested in talking to very seasoned executive coaches. So you see my information at the bottom of the page. We'll keep it there for a while so you have a chance to write it down. So entrepreneurs and business owners, Larry.
Wow.
Why do they go through when it comes to accountability?
You know, so we touched on it before because you said it. It comes from family. It comes from self. Sometimes there's an investor, even with an entrepreneur, that there's going to be accountability. There's also the team, right? To who you're hiring. You know, one of the most challenging and rewarding clients I had was someone who said he took it too serious. It's my decision. I'm making it, and therefore it's at my desk, and no one should care when I say do it. It's like, wait, yo, that's maybe a little bit too far. It's too extreme. We got to bring your people in. We got to enroll. You're looking at this too harsh. And right. It's my money and I'm accountable. It's like, yes, but it's also your team and they're working for you, and you can't be that authoritarian with them. Right. So there was a mindset change of, well, yeah, you can be the buck where the buck stops, but maybe you should delegate a little bit.
Yeah, that's one aspect of it. Absolutely. This is one example of being accountable for good practices in leadership and to grow and to learn, which is the only way your business is going to grow.
Well, tell me if you don't find this, but on the solopreneurs or the smaller businesses, that someone gets into business because they came up with a product or a service that took off, and they might have hit between $2 and $10 million worth of sales, but they never learned how to run a company, and they don't know what a balance sheet is. And
it's unfathomable, but yes,
but it's real life, right? It's not. Yeah. And their accountability, they don't see accountability. They see business, right?
And yet you do have people like my client and certain clients you've had who get it. It's almost like an addiction. Is the first step is admitting that you have a problem. And so what is that moment that I'm trying to think through sort of clients I've worked with myself? When is the moment that you say conclusively, it's because I'm not holding myself accountable? What is that moment that happens?
I think if you're working with us, we put it in your face, right? Because if they haven't held themselves accountable, then someone has to come to them and tell them, hey, this doesn't fly. This doesn't work.
Right.
I have a business and you might make a good living, but this isn't what's proper and appropriate.
Right.
And there's probably a better way that includes better growth and better flow in your business. And just it will be so much nicer to be
Yeah.
for everyone involved if you just would pull back a little bit and then take on a position of leadership and
Mhm.
accountability.
Yeah. And one of the odd things of the human brain is, one, we can't really see ourselves. So there, as you say, somebody external party, really any external party, where there's some trust and some belief that they know what they're doing, has to put that, the mirror in front of you and say, look at what you're doing. It's not being accountable. But there's also, it's also a degree to which you are self-aware and vulnerable and open. The people really most benefit from working with you, or for me, which is very much sort of the same type of person, has to be willing to address an issue and has to create a culture. And we're going to talk about creating a culture of accountability in a second. Has to create a culture that gives him the feedback that he needs to know if he's doing something wrong and not being held accountable, especially if he doesn't have any board or supervisory whatever on top of him or her. So how does one create a culture of accountability? Now, you and I talked earlier a little bit before this podcast that there are nuts and bolts activities with accountability. One of the questions I get all the time is, what is accountability? How do I hold my people accountable? And for that, you have everything from software to what I also tell them, which is just keep a notebook so you know what people have promised if your brain has too much going on in it. So CEOs tend to, obviously, because it's not them, they can see when somebody's not being accountable, can learn that part really well. But what about when they can't learn it for themselves? And/or are there alternatives, because those project-based sort of software programs or the accountability exercises, whatever you do, the recording of them is more of a technical manual activity. Something else has got to give, and that usually is the culture of accountability. Tell us a little bit about the culture of accountability in your experience.
Well, I remember, I think that nature has something to do with it. Nature's an immovable force, and when you create a culture that's not a positive influence and that's not effective, you find it either in the numbers or in the turnover of your staff.
Yeah, turnover staff, I was just going to say.
So somehow you're going to get that light shine on you. And the question is, do you have the introspection to sit there and say, oh, maybe that's me. Maybe that's something I've done or not done, right? And I think when you're talking about the culture of accountability, there's the nature part of it that forces you to look at it. There's an outside person, which could be an accountant, an attorney, some professional of a sort, that says, "Hey, guy, you should look at this. Maybe you're not treating your employees the way."
Right. That's a trusted advisor, which essentially we are trusted advisors who have the permission to show the mirror up to the person.
And I was going to say, and I actually think that a trusted advisor becomes separate than one of the other professionals, because a legal or a financial professional has specific duty legally and financially.
Yeah.
We're there to just shake them.
And in some cases that is necessary. I mean, as I said, the first step is admitting you have a problem.
And it's the hardest. The first step is the hardest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next step is obviously that when it comes to accountability, I defaulted a lot to the software solutions, the notebook solutions, the train your memory, and as we're saying, that's maybe half of it. But when you have a culture of high performance, no excuses culture, but a friendly culture, that is, accountability happens when people support one another. And also when people are honest about things, not nasty, but honest. And we can talk about some other attributes of accountability. And that leads us now to them. they've created a culture of accountability. They may have some inkling they need to be held accountable. What can a CEO do other than hire a trusted advisor? I think of it always as is there a certain discipline and good habits, but it's very easy to deviate from that. There's also the accountability that we talked about briefly, which is, I think I'm holding myself accountable. Look at the results. They're fine. Nobody's leaving, but is he truly being accountable? And if so, how? Or is he just being lucky? Something we say at Vistage a lot is, if you're putting up a fight about the need to go through the programs we go through, is it because you're lucky, or is it because you don't know what you're doing? You know what you're doing. There's a difference between knowing what you're doing and having luck.
No, agreed. I think for the nature of this conversation, we need to take accountability and put it into two places.
Mm-hmm.
Number one is performance. So performance is when if they're high achieving, and it's a totally measurable statistic, right?
Yeah.
You just figure out if you're into sales, or if you're into shipping, or if you're into whatever it is, you can create a metric that will say you are exceeding levels, you are meeting levels, or you are below levels, and you can and make it. And that's sort of very objective. And the question is, what do you do with the subjective work? And how do you subjectively say somebody's meeting our goal? So here's what I do. I work with clients, and at the end of the year, so starting in November, I make them do a strategic plan and a review of the year, right? So the barometer I like them to use is their North Star. So when people talk to me about what makes a good culture, a bad culture, and how do you create it, my answer is, I don't think you create cultures. They're in the DNA of the leadership. It oozes. It's not something you say, now we're going to be, and then fill in whatever blank you want to fill in. You can't say, okay, now all of a sudden we're going to be this, because it's the way you're looking at the business and where the business is going. And then is your team on board with that? So if you take a strategic plan, and if you plan out your year and your 3 years and your 5 years, that's sort of the accountability that we can have with CEOs, is saying, you're off your North Star. It's a weird accountability, but it's saying, you said at the beginning, and you said for the past 2 years that you wanted X, and whatever X could be. And you wanted to make sure that your business was monetized, and that you would be able to play golf 3 days a week, 2 weeks in Italy, if that's what it is. And you're so far off the mark, you're not going to get there.
Yeah. And that's a good point, which is, it starts with commitments you've made to yourself. And more importantly, were those really commitments? Or was that fill in the blank? When I look at my clients, most of them, I would say it goes into 3 parts. There are 3 parts to this. There's the top level, which is by nature, they're highly accountable to themselves. They want their team to be accountable. And you see the results. I mean, those are the high performers. This comes back to, does a CEO's accountability really matter? Yeah, those I've seen who can hold themselves accountable. Now, it so happens that the ones I'm thinking about right now tend to have people above them, a group of investors, i.e. a board that the investors sit in, but some sort of governance model sitting above them, which is in the form of some sort of a board, advisory, but board of directors. So they not only have, I think, the discipline and good habits, but they also have a company like a hired CEO that has a structure that holds them accountable. Then you have the next ones who know they're struggling with that. And those are the ones that we usually get, who say, help me figure this out. And slowly but surely, because this is not an easy topic, because it requires a lot of willingness to be open and vulnerable, as well as an understanding of what accountability is. And they're the ones that we usually work with, and they eventually get it. They may not be the high performance of those who just naturally are accountable and have somebody or something above them. Sure that. Then there's those who don't get the accountability, and those are the troubled child. And I have to admit, I have a few members in the past and clients who didn't get that, and rued the day that they didn't get it. And it was very, very hard sometimes to make them understand it's their accountability. They are the cause of the matter. If they do, perfect example, somebody who decided sort of, well, was having terrible employee issues. The turnover was high. And his belief was that you shouldn't make people feel bad, I guess the best way. In other words, build a hierarchy of performers. So, the high performers were treated just like the low performers. And that was really him coming off the account. His accountability was that he had to run a company pretty much along the lines that most people do. You reward performance and you weed out non-performance. It got so bad, and I told him, you're just waiting for disaster. And lo and behold, his high performers started leaving him with all the garbage. Even his sister left the company.
Mm.
Yeah. So when you don't hold yourself accountable, and this gentleman did not have a board, it was just him, and he was really struggling getting over himself to be accountable. All I kept saying to him was, you're gonna run yourself on the ground. That's a lack of accountability. The accountability for a CEO is to build a performance organization, and you're going contrary just because you don't think you're that kind of CEO. And indeed, the company fell apart.
Yep.
And even his sister left. So those are sort of the three sort of tiers I think of in terms of how people perform. But they're just a direct correlation between the performance of an organization, a business, and the accountability of the CEO. And our jobs are to make sure that at least the second tier gets what they need to go up to highly accountable. The third tier, I don't know about you, I've never really had much success. They're lost souls, and you find yourself, you're going in circles trying to even get them aware of the problem.
Now, it's really funny. I don't know if they're lost souls. So that's really
that's actually a good point. They may not be so lost.
No, they're not. They're and it's not, and it's funny. I don't even know that they're high achieving, but what they are is happy with where they are, and don't feel the need to add stress of accountability, of being sure answering to someone, right? So my question to them is always: is that in the greater good of where your North Star is personal? I mean, maybe it. One person I let go, and I said, "You just do as you wish." I will never be able to.
A member of your group.
Yeah, and we parted, but on friendly terms. But there was nothing I would ever be able to do to get him to do more for his business, to create a better life for him. Who wants to work 65 hours a week? Some people do. Guess what? You could work 50. You could work 45. Right. How about that? Let's set up Nope. Don't want it. That means I need to be worried about this, and I don't want to worry about this. So that, he wasn't lost, but he was just okay with where he was.
Yeah, and that is the kiss of death. I'm trying to say. I wrote a book about leadership, business leadership, or just disruptive business leadership. And very, very early on, I say, look, if that's your mindset that, we're good the way we are, you're going to get trampled at some point. Yeah, you're going to get trampled by a competitor or a new entrance. The publishing industry, as we know, it was completely torn apart by Amazon. So if you're sitting there going, everything's great, nothing's going to change, and really it's good, it's a sure sign that something very bad is going to happen quickly. And that's my take on it, is often you have to have something really bad happen before somebody somewhere wakes up to the fact that it was most often the CEO's lack of accountability or culture he or she created that's not accountable. Brings to mind somebody like Elizabeth Holmes, who, now that it's, the decision's been handed down, although I assume she can appeal it and so forth, is she did not hold herself to very basic accountabilities, like don't lie to your investors. Don't go out with a prototype that doesn't work. Right. Very basic non-accountability. She just nobody was holding her accountable because I guess her charm, her looks and so forth, wooed weak men to support her without asking the right questions, which just occurred to me is one way to help a person understand that their accountability is lagging or wanting, which is you ask him very pointed questions. I had a client that he just could not tell me. There was a floor under which he could talk about his business. His business was not near where he lived. He lives in New York. Business is in Boston. It took me a year to get him cognizant of the fact that when I ask him a question like, what are your accounts receivable right now? And are you paying them off? And you say everything's okay. And then a week later you go, well, I looked further at it and no, we have a big problem. Yeah. And it took some while. Now he's being much more accountable to a fault, because now he knows all the details about his company, but he's got his hands around the issue finally.
No, that it does. So that's where the technology and the performance factor comes in, right? So while people build, they should also make sure that there's a way to measure of what their success is like, and that there should be some form of dashboard. I used to call it a flash report when I had, right? We would look every morning and we'd see a flash of the business. It was like taking the blood pressure and a blood test and all at the same time, and you would say, okay, I know where it is. And over time, a good CEO begins to say, oh, that number doesn't look right. And then you call the person responsible for that number and say, okay, tell me. So, there is that performance accountability that business owners should be using to protect themselves for their accountability, right? They're accountable to someone, even if it's themselves, to make sure that it's flowing.
Right. And we're going to come back to that topic after I make this little announcement, but I do think we should talk a little bit about technologies, use of technologies, new ways to hold yourself accountable or for others to hold you accountable. But a dashboard is a great idea. I mean, that, almost all of us, I think, who do this work at some point say, you got to develop a dashboard.
Yep.
Well, what is that? Well, it's KPIs. What's a KPI? Because when you don't know the KPIs, or key KPIs, or key performance indicators, then it's sometimes impossible to hold yourself accountable. In fact, you could be highly accountable and still be accountable for the wrong things, for example. So this is, I'm John Firth, sitting here with Larry Reines, and we're answering the question, what a CEO's accountability does a CEO's accountability really matter? I think we've put to bed that the fact is, yes, it really matters. But now we're going to talk a little bit about how, especially for entrepreneurs who by nature have to show their own discipline and good habits to hold themselves accountable especially when they're starting out and don't really have any kind of a board or governance model that will help them with that. So if you have any questions or comments right now, we'd love to show them up in this banner. But more importantly, we'd like you to contact us with any comments and answer any questions that you have about today's session, or if you'd like to talk to us about an issue or something. And here's Larry's information. We'll keep that up for a while so you can copy it if you want to get in touch with him. So Larry, you talked about the dashboard. Great idea, because it's sort of like the mirror. It's like, in fact, I have KPIs as Vistage chair, and then a lot of times I don't want to look at them because I don't think they're going to be that great. That's doing myself a disservice. That's being unaccountable.
Right.
For example. So what else do you do to bring it home to especially a small business owner that, one, they're not holding themselves accountable, but two, it doesn't matter except for the fact that you might fail? And how do you get it home to, because a lot of people are scared to death of failure to the point where they don't understand what failure is.
Right.
It gets pretty intense there. So what are other ways that you make people aware of the fact that small business owners or larger entities that they're avoiding the accountability discussion in their head?
Well, so that it sort of goes back to the strategic plan and what you want to do and what you're looking to accomplish in a certain time period. And what is it? Sunday, Monday, every Sunday night when you're about to start the week,
Mm-hmm.
look at what your objectives are going to be. The question is, are you pulling in? And I try to get people to pull in their annual objectives to the weekly look to say, are you tackling this? And guess what? If you're not, then you're not.
Right.
And I've sort of created actually a fun Excel spreadsheet that says
Uh-huh.
these are the things you said you're going to do that have short-term, medium, and long-term effects. Did you do it?
Mm-hmm.
And like, even if you didn't do it, you have to look at it and you have to see the word done is not next to it, right?
Right.
Very simple. This is what you said you were going to do. This is what you want to accomplish. And did you do it? And then what do you want to do this week? And are you going to do anything that you didn't do? And,
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of an accountability call, but it's more of a call to action, right? Because it can't be just, so accountability sounds so negative. But if you flip it and say you need to make a call to action here to achieve your goals versus you'd have to be held accountable for your goals, it's a more invigorating way to address it and to approach it.
So it's interesting you bring that up. Basically, what we're saying is the first accountability is an easy one because it's external, which is the results. You're being held by the result, accountable for the results. How you choose to do that is why we hired you, or why you decided to start a company. But yeah, clear. You're really talking about a project spreadsheet, almost, I think, from what I hear from you, a sort of it, which is these are your accountabilities. All of this is going to add up to success. So if you're starting to slip in your accountabilities, I have to assume something bad's going to happen. But my question to you is this a spreadsheet when you do sessions, and I don't know the exact format of what you do at TAB, but when you do sessions and accountability to-dos show up, do you actually record them in that spreadsheet and go back to the client?
Absolutely. No. I mean, there are sprint. Sometimes there's a sprint goal,
Uh-huh.
right? And you'll articulate it. Is it a SMART goal? And if it's a SMART goal, then what is it you want to do? And the tasks you need to get it done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's here. This is it. Boom. It's almost in your face.
Do you do that on an individual basis, or when your group comes together, do you talk about it?
No, I do that individually.
Yeah.
That becomes that becomes more private.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was trying to do it in a group, and it was frankly just boring, because when you're not part of the discussion, and then to hear someone say, did you remember to contact the Small Business Administration because they will help you with a financing at much cheaper rates than any other option. Yeah, it's kind of boring to go through 50 items of that sort with everybody there. I mean,
meeting, yeah.
Yeah, I originally thought it would be to quasi embarrass them a little bit, because their peers, so much of having peers there is obviously to be seen as one of them, but it turned out just to be boring. So
what I should say, what we do is we leave every meeting with something that's big, the biggest thing they have to do that has to be done by the next meeting, right? So what's your takeaway? And you take that takeaway, and then the group holds you accountable for that. Now, in between, there are other things that are longer term that might not make the number one list.
Yeah, well, and there is, in the nature of the work we do, there are different activities that people engage in, and they all have different kinds of accountabilities. My favorite in terms of just figuring out how you get them to do it is the ongoing of something. I'm going to ongoing, do something. It's not a beginning, middle, and end type of activity. It's really, you need to check yourself. That one's always, on an ongoing basis. Notice how you're occurring to somebody. Are your behaviors off-putting? Are you being empowering? That's not like by then and then you will have solved the issue, or then and then started something. It's very hard to have a beginning. It's, your whole life should be about constantly assessing your degree of empathy and being able to behave and react well. And then there's some that are very easy. It's like, get an investment banker to help you sell the company in the next 2 weeks, because you got to sell it now. That one's really clear. There's all that other mush. But I like that idea. I do record the accountabilities, but what I find is in the heat of the one-to-one discussions, often you forget to go back to what they had made themselves accountable. It's just a difficult thing that I find is I'll end a conversation, it'll be awesome, really, cut down the heart of the matter. I may even have an accountability, but didn't go through accountabilities that they still haven't realized. So that's something I have to hold myself accountable for.
Yeah. By the way, I'd be happy to share the spreadsheet that I'm referring to. And it's visual, and it's also flexible to change.
All of these have to be flexible. Yeah. Great. Well, I see we're coming up to the hour. I don't know, Larry, can you tell how many people visited? I don't see anything on the
I don't see anything.
But this has been a fascinating conversation. We will take this live broadcast and possibly broadcast it again, probably also do use some of it in clips and so forth. But I, as always, learn something, and especially around how I'm going to hold my people accountable. I don't know, Larry, is there something that stuck in your mind about how you want to hold people accountable?
No.
Hold yourself accountable, or just the accountability theme, something that stuck out for you?
No, I love it. So the part that sticks with me is the outside investor or board as a motivator for accountability for the CEO, because I've never really used that as a tool. And it sounds like it's a tool for a lot of reasons. We both operate boards, so we know the value of a board. Mm-hmm. Outside investors and sometimes can take a more active role to help inspire the CEO, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, because they can tell if a CEO is not being accountable, usually because investors look at the numbers before anything else. And as soon as the number's not making them happy, they'll drill down on it. And eventually an accountability issue will surface. But I see it's now 1:00. Again, thank you to anybody who's watching us. And thank you, Larry, for a really fascinating discussion. And I see my information is right below. Larry, you wanted to show your information really quickly in case somebody wants to get in touch with you?
Yes, I will, right here.
Oops, there we go. Sorry, I think we both did it at the same time. Great. Well, have a great day. And again, thank you, all of you who sat in on this, or at least part of it.
Thank you so much, guys.